In 2011, revelations that journalists had hacked the phones of celebrities, politicians, and even crime victims shook the British public. What followed was a moment of reckoning that went down in history, the Leveson Inquiry, a public investigation into the ethics, culture, and practices of the UK press. The inquiry was launched after it was revealed that journalists from the News of the World had hacked into the voicemail of murdered schoolgirl Millie Dowler. The scandal sparked national outrage and raised urgent questions about how far the press had strayed from basic standards of decency. Chaired by Lord Justice Leveson, the inquiry set out to uncover how such unethical behaviour has become normalised within British journalism. So, has the Leveson Inquiry made a difference to the way media operates in the UK? I believe it's made a difference in theory or principle, but not in practice. The Leveson Inquiry marked a landmark attempt to reform British journalism. It undoubtedly improved media ethics and accountability, but it failed to dismantle the deeper ideological and hegemonic structures that continue to mould how the press operates today. This argument will be explored and supported throughout this essay. In order to understand this limitation, it's important to examine how the British press maintained its position of power, even in the face of reform. The British press, despite being under close scrutiny and heavy criticism, managed to retain much of its cultural and political influence. Its established networks, ownership structures, and ability to shape public discourse ensured that it remained central to national debate. As public trust was eroded, the press adapted, repositioning itself as both a watchdog, being a defender of democracy, and a victim of state overreach. The press adaptation meant that it preserved its authority within the public sphere. As mentioned before, the Leveson Inquiry was a landmark in the development of British media. For the first time, the press's power and ethics were closely examined in public. It resulted in the closure of the News of the World, suggested a new independent regulator, and sparked debates about press freedom and responsibility to the public. The structure of media power can be understood as a pyramid of influence. At the top sits ownership, powerful figures who decide which narratives dominate the media landscape. Below them are the editors who shape how these narratives are presented to the public, and next up are journalists, operating within editorial boundaries that reflect their organisation's interests. Finally, at the base lies public opinion, which is formed through repeated exposure to these dominant ideas. In this way, hegemony flows from the top down, reinforcing existing power structures even without direct coercion and control. This continuity of power flows shows that the Leveson Inquiry did little to actually change the hierarchies that shape how the British media works. Michael Foucault's theory of discourse offers a useful framework for assessing the Leveson Inquiry's impact. Foucault argued that discourse transmits and produces power. It reinforces, but it also undermines and exposes it. In other words, discourse operates as both a product and a producer of power, simultaneously reinforcing and destabilizing authority. It shapes, challenges, and redefines existing power structures. The Leveson Inquiry temporarily disrupted dominant media narratives by exposing unethical practices and amplifying the voices of previously marginalized victims. However, once the hearings ended, stories framing the press as under threat quickly returned. This reassertion of familiar power dynamics suggests that while the inquiry temporarily questioned the press's authority, it didn't significantly alter how media power operates in the UK, supporting Foucault's idea that power is never eradicated, only redistributed and reorganised through changing discourses. This persistence of media power is evident in the case of Max Mosley. In 2008, Mosley successfully sued the News of the World for publishing false claims about his private life, highlighting the press's intrusion into personal affairs. While the legal ruling forced the newspaper to pay damages and issue an apology, the broader patterns of media influence remains unchanged. From a Foucauldian perspective, the press continued to shape what could be publicly discussed and who could speak, presenting privacy breaches as rare events while reinforcing the narrative that sensational reporting serves the public interest. In this way, the media absorbed criticism and stayed in control, showing that the inquiry didn't make a big difference to press power in the UK. Louis Althusser argued that ideology represents the imaginary relationship of individuals to their real conditions of existence. After the inquiry, many of the same newspapers that had been criticised for unethical behaviour reframed the story to present themselves as defenders of speech. They published articles that warned of threats to press freedom. By doing this, they shifted attention away from their wrongdoing and instead portrayed themselves as victims of government control. This strengthened the public belief that the press was in the right and allowed it to maintain its influence, showing how media can absorb criticism and turn it to its advantage. This shows that the Leveson Inquiry didn't bring real change to media power and the way in which it operates in the UK, as the media was able to manipulate public perception to protect itself. A clear example of the limited impact of Leveson's recommendations is in the creation of IPSO, the Independent Press Standards Organization. Leveson had recommended a new independent regulator with legal backing to hold newspapers accountable, but instead, major newspapers set up IPSO, a self-regulatory body run by the industry. Critics have argued that IPSO remains closely tied to the very organizations it's supposed to oversee, limiting its effectiveness. This case demonstrates how Leveson's proposed reforms were diluted to protect existing power structures. In Althusserian terms, IPSO functions as an ideological mechanism that maintains the media's authority while giving the appearance of accountability, showing how ideology and hegemony function to preserve the status quo. Despite its limits, the inquiry had an indirect impact on media culture. It heightened public awareness of ethics, privacy, and accountability. Audiences began to decode media messages more critically, a process described by Stuart Hall, who said, "Media messages are encoded by producers and decoded by audiences." He describes audiences as taking one of three standpoints, either dominant, negotiated, or oppositional. This shift in audience engagement shows how even when the institutional press maintains its power, the public can challenge and reinterpret media narratives. In the changing media landscape, with the rise in digital news, social media platforms, and citizen journalism, these oppositional or negotiated or dominant readings are amplified, giving new voices the ability to question traditional narratives and influence public debate. While this shows that the Leveson Inquiry encouraged a more critical public, the main structures of the press power in the UK have stayed mostly the same. The inquiry may have changed how people respond to the media, but it did little to shift who controls the narrative. The Leveson Inquiry was a milestone in media accountability. It revealed unethical practices, sparked public debate, and led to reforms intended to protect privacy and integrity, yet its long-term impact has been limited. Through Gramsci's hegemony, we see the persistence of elite control. Through Althusser's ideology, the press continues to reproduce dominant worldviews, and through Foucault's discourse, we recognize that power has shifted but not dissolved. The same media empires remain influential, just operating with more caution. So, has the Leveson Inquiry made a difference to the way media operates in the UK? The answer is yes, but only partially. It changed the conversation, not the system. It improved ethical awareness and transparency, but left ownership and ideology untouched. The inquiry reshaped how the media is perceived. More scrutinized, more challenged, more questions, yet not fundamentally how it operates. In essence, Leveson opened the door to reform, but the industry never fully stepped through it. Ultimately, the legacy of the Leveson Inquiry is a reminder that meaningful media reform requires more than just recommendations. It requires enforcement, accountability, and political will. Although the inquiry encouraged public debate and made the press briefly reflect on its behaviour, real structural change stopped as soon as the inquiry challenged the interests of the powerful. In my opinion, the Leveson Inquiry did something, but not everything. It showed the public what needed to change, exposed the consequences of unchecked press power, and proved that regulation matters. But without Leveson Part 2, without stronger oversight, and without sustained pressure on media institutions, its impact remains incomplete.